I'm Nathan, and before we start, I want you to understand one thing about the man in this story, because it's the thing everyone in that town got wrong. They thought a soldier was a hammer, something loud, something that breaks a door and moves on. Griffin Kilgore wasn't a hammer. His whole job, the classified part they redacted out of his file, was recovery, going into the worst places on earth and reading the language that fear leaves on a human body so he could bring people home. He didn't fight where his enemies were strong. He waited. He read the pattern. And when he came back from a deployment nobody was allowed to know about and found his 7-year-old daughter in a burn ward with 31 wounds arranged in a sequence he recognized, he didn't call a lawyer because the family who did it owned every lawyer, every judge, and every deputy for 60 miles. This is a story about a town that mistook a quiet man for a safe one. It's about how a father who spends his life decoding cruelty answered the people who thought cruelty was a language only they could speak. Stay to the end, because the last thing he did, the thing at the foundry, is the part they never saw coming until it was already on top of them. The plane touched down in Charlotte 11 days early, and Griffin Kilgore still did not know why. He had spent 4 months somewhere the maps didn't label, doing work his own mother would never be allowed to hear about, and the recall order had come without explanation. Just a name, his commander's name, and 4 words on the message board: go home, go now. Colonel Dorn Whitlow was not a dramatic man. In 19 years, Griffin had heard him raise his voice exactly once. So when Whitlow bumped him to the front of a rotator flight and quietly slid a folded slip of paper into his hand at the airfield, a phone number, no name, Griffin understood that something had gone wrong at a level the colonel could feel but could not fix from a desk. He drove the rental north out of the city with the windows down, trying to outrun the feeling. Halewick, North Carolina, was 90 minutes into the foothills, a foundry town wrapped around a river, and the Ashcroft family had owned it for 100 years. His wife's family. Iron at first. Ashcroft Ironworks still cast parts nobody else would touch, and then the bank, and then the courthouse, and then everything the bank and the courthouse could reach. Griffin had married Renata Ashcroft 8 years ago knowing the family was cold and never guessing how far the cold went down. He had missed things. He knew that. A man who deploys misses birthdays, first steps, the slow, small changes in a marriage. But he told himself Maisie was safe, because Maisie had her mother, and her grandfather, and a whole town that carried the family name like a flag. That was the story he had let himself believe for 4 months in a place with no phones. The hospital was in the next county over, which was the first thing that was wrong. Ashcrofts did everything in Halewick, everything except this. He parked crooked, went in through the wrong doors, and a charge nurse named Viola Serrano met him in the corridor of the pediatric burn unit and said his name like a question and then like an apology. He asked to see his daughter. Vi Serrano looked at his boots, still dusted with another country, and led him to a door with a paper number on it, and did not follow him in. He did not recognize her face. That is a sentence a father should never have to think, and Griffin thought it standing 3 feet from his own child, because the small round face he had memorized was wrapped and swollen and wrong, and only when she turned her head and found him with one visible eye and breathed the word "daddy" did the floor come back under him. He crossed the room. He was very careful with his hands. He had held broken people before, and he knew how to hold someone who hurt everywhere, and he used every ounce of that terrible knowledge on his own little girl. Later, in the hall, Vi Serrano checked that they were alone and whispered the number to him because the chart wouldn't. 31, she said. 31 separate burns. And they're not from one day. They're weeks apart. Some are healed. She said it the way you confess a thing you should have reported and were too afraid to. The doctor who admitted her in Halewick wrote it up as a cooking accident. Dr. Cabot. He does the family's paperwork. She swallowed. I'm not supposed to be telling you any of this. Griffin thanked her in a voice that did not sound like his own, and went to find the men who did it, and found them celebrating. The lobby had a coffee bar and a wall of windows, and Warwick Ashcroft was standing at the center of it with a paper cup raised like it was crystal. Griffin knew his father-in-law the way you know weather. Warwick was 70, silver, unhurried, a man who had never once in 8 years finished a sentence he didn't want to finish. Beside him stood Renata, Griffin's wife, Maisie's mother, in a pale coat, laughing at something, her hand on her father's arm. And around them, cousins, and a lawyer, and a man Griffin didn't know in an expensive suit, all of them lifting cups, toasting. Easy, the way people are easy when a hard thing is finally behind them. They were 4 floors and a county away from the child, and they were happy. Warwick saw him. That was the moment Griffin would keep. The old man's eyes found him across the lobby and did not widen, did not flinch, did not do a single thing a guilty man's eyes do. Warwick simply lowered his cup an inch, tilted his silver head, and smiled at his son-in-law, the way a landlord smiles at a tenant who is behind on rent. Then he turned back to his toast. Renata's face, when she saw Griffin, did something more complicated. It broke, a little, and then it hardened, and then it looked away, and in that half-second, Griffin learned more than any chart could have told him. A sheriff's deputy stood near the doors, off to the side. A big, soft-faced man named Odie Hearn who had clearly been sent to keep the peace, and clearly hated it. He came over quietly, hat in his hands, and did not meet Griffin's eyes. "Mr. Kilgore, I'm real sorry." He glanced at the toasting family, and his jaw worked. "I want you to know some of us. Some of us know what this is. But I'll be straight with you so you don't waste your hope." He lowered his voice to almost nothing. "They own this town. The courthouse, the bank, my boss, the man who signs my checks. I've watched things happen in Halewick that would put anybody else under the jail, and I've watched every one of them slide right off. Nothing sticks to that family. Nothing ever has." He finally looked up. "If you go the regular way, you'll lose. I hate it, but you'll lose." Griffin nodded slowly and looked past the deputy at the little celebration by the windows, and felt something in him go very quiet and very organized, the way it went before the worst kind of work. Then he went back upstairs, sat by his daughter's bed while she slept, and turned on the small lamp and looked, really looked, at the pattern on her hands. Most people, if they had been able to bear looking at all, would have seen only horror. A grid of small healed circles and fresh ones, along the backs of both hands, up the inside of each forearm, stopping, always stopping, where a sleeve would cover them. Griffin saw something else. Griffin saw a schedule. He had spent his adult life in the study of how human beings break other human beings on purpose. Recovery work meant sitting across from people who had survived captivity and learning to read the marks their captors left, because the marks told you who did it, and how they thought, and what they wanted. And torture, real methodical coercion, is never random. It has grammar. It escalates on a curve. It leaves the face and the hands and the places a victim will see every single day. So the memory does the work when the torturer is resting. It stops short of anything a stranger would notice in public. It repeats on an interval, because the waiting is the weapon. 31 burns, weeks apart, symmetrical, placed for the victim's own eyes, hidden from the world's, escalating in size along a line he could have drawn with a ruler. This was not a woman who lost her temper at a stove. This was a program. Somebody had done this to his daughter the way a patient teacher works through a lesson plan, and they had done it slowly enough and evenly enough that they must have believed no one who mattered would ever come home to read it. Griffin sat in the dark and read it anyway. He read it the way he'd read a wall of tally marks in a cell 6,000 miles away, and somewhere in the second hour, without any heat at all, he made a decision that would end several lives, and he said it out loud to his sleeping daughter, in a voice softer than the machine's. "Good thing," he told her, "I didn't fly home for a courtroom." Griffin Kilgore did not do courtrooms, he did recoveries, and a recovery starts the same way every time. You learn the enemy before you ever let the enemy learn you. He did not go to war the next morning. That was the first thing the Ashcrofts would have gotten wrong about him, if they'd bothered to wonder. He got a motel room 2 counties away, under a name that wasn't his, paid cash, and for 6 days he did nothing that looked like anything. He visited Maisie in the mornings, and read to her and let Warwick's lawyers see a broken man who came and went and asked no questions. In the afternoons he built the thing he actually needed, which was a picture, not of one crime, but of a machine. He started with the pattern, because the pattern was the only witness who couldn't be bought. He photographed his daughter's injuries the way he'd been trained to document a recovered captive, scaled, dated, mapped. Then he did the part that made Dr. Eloise Park, the burn surgeon at the county hospital, put down her coffee and close her office door. Griffin laid the photographs out on her desk, in the order the wounds had healed, and showed her the interval. "You already know. he said. You wrote non-accidental in your notes, and somebody upstairs told you to soften it. I'm not asking you to fight your hospital. I'm asking you to date them. Just the dates, oldest to newest. Dr. Park dated them. 22 of the 31 fell on a Sunday. The Ashcrofts did their lessons, it turned out, on the Lord's Day, after church, in the hour Renata always took Maisie to her grandfather's house for family time. That interval was a key, and Griffin turned it. Because a program that runs every Sunday is a program with witnesses. Somebody drove the car, somebody was in that house, somebody heard. And in Griffin's experience, the ugliest secrets are almost always kept by the youngest person in the room. Because children are made to watch as part of the lesson, and children keep what they see. Her name was Sunny Ashcroft. She was 16, Warwick's grandniece, the daughter of the man who ran the family's muscle. An uncle named Thad Ashcroft, thick through the shoulders, a smile like a slammed drawer. Griffin found Sunny not by hunting her, but by being findable. Sitting in a diner she passed after school, day after day, a sad, calm man doing nothing, until the day her curiosity won, and she slid into the far end of his booth and said, "You're Maisie's dad." And then, before he could answer, "I have to show you something, and then I have to never see you again." She had been made to hold the timer. That was the detail that told Griffin the whole shape of it. The family tradition had a name they used behind closed doors, the tempering. Ashcrofts who were going to carry the name were tempered, as children, burned on a schedule until the family was satisfied the child had learned that pain belonged to Ashcrofts and not to them, that an Ashcroft owned pain the way they owned the town. Warwick had been tempered. Renata had been tempered, at 7, in that same house, which was the rot at the center of her, the reason she could stand in a lobby and toast. And the family made the next generation of children participate, hold the timer, watch, so that watching would make them Ashcrofts too. Sunny had been holding the timer for 2 years. She had also, for 2 years, been quietly recording it on a cracked phone she kept in a boot, because some part of her had refused to be made. She gave Griffin everything, 31 time-stamped recordings. And one more thing, one she almost couldn't say. The reason they'd started on Maisie early, out of the normal order. Maisie had seen the furnace. Ashcroft Ironworks ran a special melt on the east side of the yard, and the family used it for more than iron. 9 months earlier, a foundry foreman named Otis Frame had started asking the wrong questions about what went into that melt and who paid to make things disappear inside it. Otis Frame had gone missing in March. Everyone in Halewick knew, and nobody said. What nobody knew was that Maisie, 6 years old, wandering where a child wanders during family time, had seen her grandfather and her uncle put something into the east furnace that used to be a man. She had told her mother, because you tell your mother, and her mother had told Warwick. So the tempering of Maisie Kilgore was 2 things at once, a family tradition and a guarantee. Burn the memory into her until the memory could never again be spoken without pain reaching up to strangle it. Make the child associate that furnace, that grandfather, that truth, with the worst thing her body knew, so that she would carry the family's murder the way she carried the family's name, in silence, in her skin, forever. They had done all of it believing the one variable that could read it would never come home in time. Griffin listened to Sunny in the diner, and did not move, and did not change his face, and inside him the quiet, organized thing finished its work and became a plan. He thanked the girl. He told her to keep going to school, to change nothing, to be invisible, and that when it was over he would make sure she and her recordings were somewhere the family could never reach. Then he sat alone until the coffee was cold, and thought about furnaces, and interval, and the grammar of pain, and how every one of those things could be spoken in more than one direction. He would not burn a child. He was not them. But he had just been handed the exact language his enemies had chosen to speak, and Griffin Kilgore spoke it better than anyone alive. He was going to answer them in it. Every principle, in his own turn, was going to be taught, patiently, on a schedule, in a sequence he could not read until it was already finished. What it felt like to be inside a lesson you could not stop. That was the recovery. And a recovery, done right, does not look like an attack until the very end. It looks like a series of small, ordinary misfortunes, until all at once, it looks like the sky coming down. He needed one more thing before he started, and it was not a weapon. It was a witness the federal government would believe, because Griffin already knew this was too big to end with just the men in that lobby, and because a smart man builds the trap so that even if he falls, the door stays shut. The number on the folded slip of paper belonged to Renard Adeyemi. Ren had been Griffin's teammate for 6 years and was now something else entirely. A task force agent who chased public corruption and the men who launder ugly money through quiet American towns. Griffin called from a gas station, and Ren listened, and when Griffin said the words Ashcroft Ironworks, the line went very still, and Ren said, "We have had a file open on that foundry for 2 years, and we have never once been able to get a person inside who lived to testify." A pause. "Griffin, whatever you're about to do it in a way I can use." So Griffin built 2 machines at once. One was the case, Sonny's recordings, Dr. Park's dated map, Vi Serrano's account, the foreman's disappearance, all of it routed to Ren through channels the Ashcrofts couldn't feel, so that the moment the family reached for a judge, the judge would already be someone else's problem. The other machine was the reckoning, the personal one, the one that would make them feel it. And Griffin understood, better than anyone, that the 2 machines had to run on the same timer. Because the instant the Ashcrofts realized the law had finally reached them, they would run for the one thing that had always saved them, the furnace, the melt, the place where evidence and men both went to disappear. Griffin's whole plan bent toward making sure that when they ran for the fire was where he wanted them. He started small, exactly the way they had. Ordinary misfortunes. The man in the expensive suit from the lobby, it turned out, was Odell Brandt, no relation to the family, a buyer, out of Atlanta, there to close on a $100 million sale of Ashcroft Ironworks' specialty services to a syndicate that needed things to disappear at industrial scale. That sale was the celebration. That sale was the thing that had made Warwick lower his cup and smile. It was also, Griffin decided, the first thread to pull. Because everything the Ashcrofts were rested on the buyer believing the family was untouchable and their operation was clean. Griffin made the buyer believe otherwise. Not with a lie. Griffin didn't need lies. He had the truth, which is heavier. But with a single anonymous package delivered to Odell Brandt's hotel room, a copy of the foreman's missing person flyer, a photograph of the East Furnace, and one line typed on a card. "There is a federal file. You are about to buy it." The deal did not collapse loudly. It collapsed the way real deals collapse. In silence, in a canceled dinner and a plane that left early. And Warwick Ashcroft spent a week not understanding why his sure thing had turned to smoke in his hands. That was the first burn. Griffin marked it in his head the way they had marked his daughter. 1. Then he went to work on the rest of them, in order, on a schedule, each one calibrated to the man. He started with the ones the family could most afford to lose, and worked inward, exactly the way a good interrogator peels a network. You never open on the center, you open on the edge and let the center watch its own edges disappear. The complicit doctor first. Griffin did not threaten Dr. Cabot. He simply mailed him, on a Sunday, a plain envelope containing a photocopy of the man's own falsified admission note beside Dr. Park's dated map, and then did the same thing again the next Sunday, and the next. No demand, no contact, just the truth arriving on the day the burns had happened, over and over, until Cabot understood that someone knew, that someone was patient, and that the interval itself was the message. By the 3rd Sunday, the doctor had hired his own lawyer and started, quietly, cooperating with a federal agent named Adeyemi, because a guilty man who is being counted down to will always, in the end, run toward the only door that looks open. The bought judge, Alma Sperry, learned that a sealed complaint about her family court rulings had found its way to the State Judicial Commission, and that the complaint was very specific, and that it had been assembled by someone who understood exactly which of her decisions had been favors. Sheriff Halden Bream discovered that his deputy Odie Hearn, soft-faced, ignored, underestimated Odie, had been keeping a private log for 11 years, and that the log was no longer only in Odie's house. One by one, the props holding up the family's impunity were kicked out, not in a courtroom where the Ashcrofts were strong, but in the dark, on a timer, where Griffin lived, and all of it built toward Thad. Thad Ashcroft was the hands. Sonny's recordings made that plain. Thad was the one who ran the sessions, the one with the stopwatch, the one who carried them out while Warwick watched, and Renata looked at the wall. If any single man was going to be taught the grammar in the language he'd chosen, it was Thad, and Griffin had thought carefully about how. He did not lay a finger on him. He did something worse, something Thad's own family had taught him to fear more than pain. He made Thad watched. Griffin arranged through Wren's task force for Thad to be picked up on an unrelated, airtight, entirely real charge, an old assault, a witness who suddenly stopped being afraid, and held. And while he was held, the recordings of the tempering were played for the other men in the county lockup, men who had daughters, men who did not care that Thad was an Ashcroft, because inside those walls the name meant nothing and the crime meant everything. Thad Ashcroft, who had spent his life making children feel helpless on a schedule, spent 19 days learning the inside of that lesson from the far side of it, on an interval he could not control, waiting for a door that only opened when other men decided. It broke something in him that had been holding the family together. On the 20th day, Thad started talking, and once Thad started, the machine Griffin had built for Wren had everything it needed, which left the two at the center, the old man who designed it, and the woman who delivered the child. Renata came to Griffin first. He had known she would. He had built the timer so she would. She found him at the motel, and she was not the woman from the lobby anymore. She was gray and shaking, and she had a suitcase, and she told him she wanted to run, together, the three of them, to disappear before it all came down. And Griffin looked at his wife, at the faint old marks he had never let himself notice on the insides of her arms, and for one moment he felt the whole tragedy of her. The 7-year-old girl who had once been tempered in that same house and had grown into a woman who could only survive by becoming what had hurt her. He felt it. And then he thought about Maisie's hand finding him in the dark with one visible eye, and he set the pity down. "You had a phone," he said. "Every Sunday you had a phone in your pocket and a car in the driveway and a daughter in the back seat. And every Sunday you drove her there. You didn't fail to save her, Renata. You delivered her." He was very quiet. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to do something you'll find much harder to live inside. I'm going to let you choose, once, the way she never got to." He slid a phone across the table. Wren's number already dialed. "Tell them everything, and you help put your father where he put Otis Frame. Or run, and find out how far the name carries once it's the thing everyone's running from." He stood up. "Either way, the town is already gone. You just get to decide who you were at the end of it." Renata Ashcroft made the call. It did not redeem her, and Griffin never pretended it did, but it gave the federal case its spine, and it gave Sonny an adult in the family finally telling the truth, and it meant that when the reckoning reached the foundry, Warwick would be standing there alone, having watched every edge of his network peel away toward the light, while he still did not understand how. Because that was the cruelty Griffin had built for the old man specifically, and it was the only one that fit him. Warwick Ashcroft's whole life was control. He had never once not known the shape of a room. So Griffin took that from him first and last. He let Warwick feel the walls come in without ever being able to see the hand doing it. The buyer gone, the doctor gone, the judge gone, the sheriff exposed, his enforcer talking, his daughter turned, the federal file swelling, and no name to put to any of it, no man to threaten, no favor to call, nothing but a rising, patient, silent pressure arriving on a schedule he could feel but could not read. For 3 weeks, Warwick Ashcroft lived inside the exact experience he had built for a 7-year-old. Helpless, watched, counted down, unable to stop what was coming, forced to wait for it. Griffin had promised his sleeping daughter the same pain. He was, in his own precise way, a man of his word. It ended, as Griffin had always meant it to, at the furnace. The federal warrants dropped on a Sunday. Griffin had asked Wren for that, the one thing he asked, that they come on a Sunday, and Warwick Ashcroft did exactly what 100 years of impunity had trained him to do. He ran for the East Melt to destroy the ledgers, the shipping manifests, the last physical proof of what the foundry really sold, the same fire that had eaten Otis Frame and been meant to eat his granddaughter's voice. Griffin was already there, not to burn him. He wanted that understood, later, by the only people who needed to understand it. He never touched the old man. He simply stood between Warwick and the door with the recordings playing aloud from a speaker in the dark. Maisie's voice, counting, because they had made her count her own burns, and he let Warwick Ashcroft stand in the roar and heat of his own furnace and listen to what he had done, with no cup to raise, and no room to own, and no one left to call. What happened next, the federal report would describe in careful words. The old man lunged for the ledgers. The catwalk over the east melt was old iron the family had never spent money to replace, because they spent money on judges instead. It gave way the way neglected things give way, all at once, and Warwick Ashcroft went into the fire he had fed for 50 years. And the thing he had done to so many others, at the very last, was done to him, and Griffin Kilgore stood on the solid side of the gap and did not reach out a hand, and did not have to. Thad hanged himself in county lockup 2 days before his transfer. Dr. Cabot and Judge Sperry and Sheriff Bream took the deals the truth left them, which is to say they took years. The syndicate that had wanted the foundry's services scattered the moment the file went public. Renata Ashcroft is serving a sentence measured in decades, and writes letters her daughter does not open, and will spend the rest of her life inside the choice she finally made too late. The name Ashcroft, which had owned a town for 100 years, and mistaken that for being untouchable, means, in Halewick today, only a courthouse getting new locks, and a foundry gone cold, and a family that learned, all at once, at the end, that nothing sticks until the right man decides to make it. Maisie Kilgore has a long road. Skin remembers even when the mind is kind enough to blur. There will be grafts and surgeries and a childhood spent learning that her hands are hers again. But she has them. And she has her father, who left the service for good, who took her far from the foothills to a flat, bright place near the ocean, and who sits with her every night while she falls asleep, and who told her only once, and will only ever tell her once, that the man in the furnace can't count anymore, and that she never has to again. I'm Nathan, and here's what stays with me about Griffin Kilgore, now that the loud part is over. We're taught to want the dramatic version of justice, the kick-in-the-door version, the screaming version, and I understand why. When someone hurts a child, everything in you wants it to be fast, and it wants it to be loud. But the reason the Ashcrofts owned that town for 100 years is that fast and loud is exactly what they knew how to survive. They had lawyers for loud. They had a furnace for loud. What they had never once prepared for was a man who could be quiet longer than they could, who read the very cruelty they'd invented and turned it back on them one patient degree at a time, and who refused to fight them anywhere except the one place they were weak, in the dark, on a schedule where patience beats power. There's a harder thing in here too, and I don't want to walk past it. Renata was a victim before she was a villain. She was tempered in that same house, by that same fire, and it made her into someone who could deliver her own daughter to it. That's real. That's how cycles of abuse actually work. They don't create only monsters. They create people who mistake surviving for belonging. But understanding where a wound comes from is not the same as excusing what the wound does. Griffin held both of those truths at once, and he still chose the child. That's the whole thing, really. When you have to choose between the person who was broken and the person being broken right now, you choose the one who's still small enough to save. Pain has a grammar. Most of us are lucky enough never to learn to read it. Griffin read it for a living, and when the worst people he ever met wrote it on his daughter, he wrote them back a sentence they never finished. If this one moved you, stay with these stories, because the quiet ones, the patient ones, are always the ones you don't see coming.